Hello there, students. Thank you for being part of this presentation. My name is Luis Silva, and today we're looking at the Cold War, 1945, all the way to 1991, and this is part 2. What will we learn today? Today we're going to analyze the revolutionary movements in India, China, and also Ghana. The Cold War was a conflict of rival ideologies between the United States and the Soviet Union that lasted from 1945 all the way to 1991. Early on in the Cold War, from 1945 to 1949, the focus of the conflict was mainly on Europe. The United States did not want European nations to fall to communism. The United States used the Truman Doctrine, the Marshall Plan, and also NATO to successfully contain communism in Europe. But beginning in 1949, containment seemed to fail as communism spread to China, Korea, and Vietnam. For almost 2,000 years, China was the world's most dominant empire because of trade along the Silk Road and the power of the ruling dynasties. As you can see, we have a timeline here at the bottom of your presentation, and you can pause this video to look at those dynasties carefully and see how China was able to dominate the world, basically through trade. In the 1600s and 1700s, European nations became powerful and began exploring as well as claiming colonies for their own benefit, of course. The Industrial Revolution in the 1700s and 1800s made Europe the center of power in the world. European nations used the idea of imperialism to control Africa and Asia as well. You have a map to the left. By the way, we have done presentations on imperialism, so you're more than welcome to go to those presentations and review what imperialism signified for those countries that were taken over and the European countries. As you can see, the map to the left-hand side, you see the countries that were dominated by European countries. Britain used the Opium Wars to claim rights in China, in this case, trading rights. By the 1900s, China was weak and divided into spheres of influence. This did not go well with many Chinese, so a group of reformers called the Nationalists was formed and called for changes. In 1912, Sun Yat-sen ended the Chinese dynasty system and created a democracy called the Republic of China. But the Republic did not modernize China or help peasants. In the 1920s, nationalist leader Chiang Kai-shek took over and ran China as a dictatorship. Meanwhile, communism was growing in China under the leadership of Mao Zedong. Mao's Communist Party gained popularity among poor peasants by offering to redistribute land from wealthy warlords. You are more than welcome to read Mao Zedong's brief biography to your left-hand side if you pause this video. From 1930 to 1949, nationalists and communists fought in a bloody civil war for control of China. Here we have basically to the left-hand side the nationalists and to the right-hand side the communists led by Mao Zedong. When World War II began, Chiang and Mao agreed to a truce from 1937 all the way until 1945 when the Second War was over. After World War II, communists gained support and began to win control of China. In 1949, the communists won the Civil War and Mao created the People's Republic of China. And here we have an image which presents the three revolutionary communists, Karl Marx, Vladimir Lenin, and Mao Zedong. In response to Mao's victory, Chiang's government fled China and set up a government in Taiwan. The United States was shocked when China fell to communism and only recognized the nationalists as the government of China. Now, based upon this propaganda poster, what changes will Mao propose for China? You can pause this video and you can identify what you see on the picture, and basically you see happy people and a prosperous China basically. But we are going to see that the opposite actually took place. Mao was determined to reshape China's economy based on Marxist socialism. He seized lands from the rich and divided the land among the poor peasants. Mao Zedong followed Stalin's example by creating collective farms and a 5-year plan to improve Chinese industry. Now, based upon this propaganda poster, what two things will Mao's Great Leap Forward focus on? Please make sure you pause this video. You can answer that question and then you can move on. In 1958, Mao began a massive program to create agriculture and industry called the Great Leap Forward. Millions of Chinese citizens were sent to work on large collective farms to grow food. Other citizens were required to work on massive industrial projects like making iron and steel or building dams and railroads. In 1958, Mao Zedong used this quote in order to convince Chinese people to work really hard. Struggle hard for 3 years, change the face of China, catch up with Britain and America. He wanted China to be able to compete with European nations as well as the United States. Let's move on. Here we have China's grain output from 1949 all the way to 1958. You see that it did increase, which was something that Mao wanted in China. His great plan, in this case, the Great Leap, started off very well, but it required forced labor and led to lots of suffering by millions of Chinese citizens, which made many of them very angry. Here we have China's grain output from 1954 all the way to 1973. The Great Leap Forward basically failed and led to severe food shortages, famine, as well as a poor quality industry. Mao ended the Great Leap Forward after 3 years only. And here we have an image of people basically going to get food as Mao's program did not work. This is a picture of Chinese peasants. Now, based upon this image, what was the purpose of Mao's Cultural Revolution? It is up to you to determine what Mao's purpose was and be able to explain what his mission, his goal was for Chinese people, in this case, students, Chinese students. After the failure of the Great Leap Forward, Mao began the Cultural Revolution from 1966 all the way to 1976. The goal of the Cultural Revolution was to emphasize Mao's strict socialist ideas and attack traditional Chinese ideas. Mao distributed to all Chinese citizens the Little Red Book, a book of his quotes that reinforced what was acceptable for Chinese communists. In this case, Mao targeted young people and many joined the Red Guards, a group to protect the culture of the revolution. Red Guards closed schools and universities, burned books, and humiliated, beat, killed people who opposed Mao's ideas. Here we have a picture to the right which represents, in this case, the Red Guards. Here we have another picture which represents the loyalty of these people to the communist leader. Here we have another picture, in this case, military personnel with the red book. Here we have a picture which shows the Red Guards burning books. Here we have another picture which shows us how people were tortured, beaten, because they opposed Mao's rule. Here we have more pictures, very brutal. Punishment for those who were not in favor of Mao's policies. The Cultural Revolution unified the Chinese people, but also led to the death or imprisonment of thousands of citizens. To the right, we have an image of execution of teachers, politicians, as well as critics of the government. Here we have Mao's attempt to change China, his programs, the first 5-year plan, 1953 to 1957. Basically, industry grew 15%. Agricultural output, however, grew very slowly. The Great Leap Forward Plan, 1958 to 1961. China suffered economic disaster, industrial declines, and food shortages, and Mao lost influence. The Cultural Revolution, 1966 to 1976. Mao regained influence by backing radicals. Purges and conflicts among leaders created economic, social, and political chaos. Let's move on. In 1976, Mao Zedong died and was followed by more moderate communist officials. Even without Mao, China remains a communist nation today. The fall of China to communism had a major impact on the Cold War between the United States and the USSR. The United States' response to the fall of China to communism was to more aggressively confront communism around the world. The United States was afraid of a domino theory in which communist nations turned their neighbors communist in this case. As you are able to see the image at the bottom, you see that once China falls, Korea also fell to communism, then Vietnam, and the United States was afraid that all of these nations would eventually fall to communism. As a result, the United States vowed to contain the spread of communism anywhere in the world. The United States acted when communism threatened the Korean Peninsula. During World War II, Korea was liberated from Japanese control by the United States Army in the south and the Soviet Army in the north. After World War II, Korea was divided along the 38th parallel line with a communist government in North Korea and a democracy in South Korea. As you can see from the image to the left here, the map, you see that North Korea was communist and South Korea was a democratic nation. In 1950, North Korea, using Soviet-supplied weapons, crossed the 38th parallel line and attacked South Korea. When South Korea appealed to the United Nations, the United States sent troops to Korea to contain communism. But when the United States pushed too close to China, the Chinese army entered the war and was able to help North Korea. After 3 years of fighting, a ceasefire was agreed to in 1953. The fighting stopped and the 38th parallel line was restored as the boundary between North and South Koreas. The United States successfully stopped communism from spreading into South Korea and showed that it was willing to fight to contain communism. Today, Korea remains divided between a communist North and a democratic South. The fighting in Korea convinced many nations to not choose a side during the Cold War. These neutral countries during the Cold War were known as the non-aligned nations. While Korea was a success, the Cold War would escalate in the 1950s and 1960s as communism threatened Africa, Southeast Asia, as well as Latin America. Now we have come to the end of this presentation. Please make sure to subscribe, and I will see you in the next presentation.